Hey guys, welcome back to Rudder Innovations, where today we're going to be installing the structure that's going to support the new floor that we're putting in our boat. Here we go. If you haven't seen part one of the floor removal, I said I was going to keep these cross braces, but I was afraid of these falling apart and blocking water from draining the back of the boat. That being said, I decided to remove these completely and just put new ones in their place. There was one in the middle that I just removed and another one just out of the frame towards the back of the boat that I'm removing now. All right, so I'm creating the templates for the bracing that goes, I guess, around this middle stringer. When you're starting from something that's already built like this, everything's not going to be exactly square or is the straight measurement of one versus the other side, and that's because the bottom is not the same anymore. So you can see this one's got a slot. Whenever they originally glassed the boat in here, they just glassed up underneath it. So you're going to have to do some customization, template, then you can cut your real piece of wood, which is what we're going to do now. The original braces were constructed with 1/2-inch marine grade plywood coated in fiberglass, and that's exactly what we're going back with. Once I had the cross braces cut out, it was time to start working on the center stringer. I used a curved portion of my old stringer as a template to start, but then wound up making additional templates with 2x4s until the stringer was flush with the bottom of the boat. All right, we have our center stringer finally finished and flush with the bottom of the boat. For the most part, I am going to be using 3M 5200 to adhere it to the bottom for bedding, and then I'm going to come back with some high strength filler and just take and blend this little lip where the stringer used to be. Also, the original boat had a slant down there and it tapered off, and I think I'm going to redo it. I am going to round the edges of this stringer. This is what my bit looks like. So we're going to run that stringer through there so it's rounded and it's easier for the fiberglass cloth to round over. Just so you can see what we're trying to achieve with the rounded edge, this is an edge that's been rounded, and this is the stock corner on the 2x4. It's a much sharper edge, and it's going to be a lot harder for fiberglass cloth to make this turn than it will to make this turn. I ran the stringer through the router table to round off the edges, which you could do with a sander or grinder. All right, so we have our center stringer cut, and we have the edges rounded on the top just so that the cloth lays down on it really nice. And then we're also sanding this portion of it just to have a good bond, have a good flat surface for the fiberglass cloth to bond to. Fiberglass has both a chemical bond and a mechanical bond. To prep the surface for the mechanical bond, typically 80 grit sandpaper will work, but when you're using the structural putty to fill any voids or knots in the stringer like I used, it was recommended to prep the surface with 16 to 20 grit sandpaper. I wore my respirator during this process because treated lumber contains arsenic and other harmful chemicals, so please make sure you're wearing the proper PPE. Before we start the fiberglass process and the structural putty, it recommended sanding it with 16 to 24 grit sandpaper. This is obviously an old 220, and what I did, it's peel and stick. It was very difficult to find this. I did find it finally from Home Depot. It wasn't at my local store, but I could get it at a different one. And now I'm gonna have to cut through the holes just so that I can connect the shop vac to this and be able to suck up as much dust as possible. To put the holes to the back, I just use a 3/8 inch drill bit and just put it against this piece of wood and push down, and it actually went through and was pretty clean. The cavities right here, just so that there's a smooth surface to bond the fiberglass to, I'm going to fill it with some putty, which is a structural bonding putty. Also, I did change the design a little bit on the backside. Originally, it went down to the ground like this, and I decided to connect it to the stern of the boat and just make a hole where the water could go through. I sanded where the structural putty would be going with 20 grit sandpaper and then wiped everything down with acetone before applying the putty. I got pretty much all the fiberglass materials and tools exclusively from Fiberglass Warehouse, who were easy to work with and extremely helpful whenever I had a question regarding their products. Here's a structural putty that I use, and because it was midsummer in Alabama, I mixed it with a 1% ratio of catalyst to putty. So for 350 milliliters of putty, I added 3.5 cc's of catalyst. The more catalyst that you add, the quicker it will cure, but the less time you'll have to work with the materials. 1% worked out great for me, and I had plenty of time to fill the voids in my stringer and apply it with a disposable spackle knife. So all of this is dry now, so we'll go ahead and lightly sand it all off to where it's flush. And we got all the holes filled, and then we can coat it with a layer of resin. This is the same process: sand it, wipe it down with acetone, apply material, and then wait for material to dry. I got their acetone polyester resin. It's supposed to remain tacky to put subsequent layers on there, so you don't have to sand in between layers. So I'm going to mix up about 650 milliliters of material of resin. We'll put 6.5 milliliters of catalyst in that. So this is a 1% ratio, even though it's kind of warm out here. And we'll mix this up, and then we'll get this stringer coated. All right, you can see that we got the entire thing coated, and every now and then, as the wood absorbs the resin, you'll see a dry spot or a mark that doesn't look wet, and you can kind of tell that all of this looks wet at this time. But here in the middle, you'll see where it'll start absorbing the resin, and you have to keep loading it with resin, or otherwise what'll happen is if you try to lay your cloth on here, the resin will be absorbed into the wood and off of the cloth, and then you'll end up with a dry layup, which won't work. So we pre-coated this with resin. Everything looks good at this point, and we're gonna wait for it to tack up, and then we'll install it in the hull of the boat. All right, we're here at the rear of the transom, and you can see the stringer used to extend into the actual transom. Now, I don't really like this because it allows water to get in there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take that high strength structural putty, and I'm going to fill that void. I already sanded it with some 20 grit sandpaper, so now I'm going to use the putty to fill it in. One of the things I realized through this build is that boats built on a production line are done quickly and not necessarily with the best design in mind, so it was cool to improve how things were assembled and reduce chances of having issues down the road. Once it was dry, I sanded flush, and it was on to the next step. All right, so here you can see that there is a separation in this stringer. It's going to be too weak like this, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to patch in or tab in some fiberglass here, join these together. Much of successful fiberglass work is preparation. I have this area sanded down with 20 grit sandpaper, wiped down with acetone, the pieces of 1708 fiberglass cloth already cut to the appropriate size, and I'll be using about 150 milliliters of the acetone polyester resin with 1.55 cc's or milliliters of catalyst. In addition, I'll be using what's called a fin roller to help release air bubbles that may form in between the cloth and my stringer. Having a cup of acetone around to clean up the fin roller after using it will enable you to use it multiple times. Best practice is to saturate the area where the cloth will be installed and then lay down the cloth and coat it with resin. You'll notice that when the cloth has been properly saturated, it will turn transparent. I added a second layer of cloth to this crack for an additional support, and during this entire process, I was looking for any air bubbles that need to be addressed with my fin roller. Thankfully, no bubbles formed, so I didn't have to use it at this point. So I have the sander hooked up, got my shop vac, and I have a fan blowing as well. And the plan is to sand all of the flat portion on the bottom of the boat and everywhere that I'm gonna have fiberglass. So here where I have these cross supports, I'm gonna do on both sides where I'll be glassing them to the actual hull of the boat, and as well as alongside the stringer where I'll be glassing that to the hull of the boat, and back here as well. Make sure you wear the proper PPE. This is the only time I wore a disposable coverall suit, though there were probably other times when I should have worn it. This was the part of the job that I was the least excited about because I hate sanding fiberglass. But having a fan, doing it outdoors, and using a wet vac with a high efficiency bag inside made it a lot more bearable than it could have been. I tried to do as much sanding as possible this day to get it over with, so I also sanded the perimeter where the new flooring would be glassed in. After finishing up the sanding, I vacuumed everything and then blew everything out with my blower to start the next step. All right, so we have everything prepped and ready to receive the structural support for our new flooring that we're gonna be putting in the boat. Now wipe down the stringer with acetone. It's about to go in. I'm gonna be using this 3M marine adhesive sealant. It's fast cure, which means it cures in 24 hours and it is a permanent bond. So, and we'll put the stringer in there after we put a bed of the sealant adhesive on there. And then we're gonna use these 2x4s and a jack just to push it down from the ceiling and wait until it adheres overnight and it'll be ready tomorrow. All right, we're gonna go ahead and remove the 2 jacks that are pushing against the ceiling and pushing the stringer down, and then we'll work on the next step. And I'm gonna start the process of filleting, is what they call it, where the stringer meets the hull of the boat. And I'm just gonna make a rounded edge with the structural putty, and then that will allow a smooth transition for the fiberglass cloth to make a turn, and we're gonna hit this on time lapse. Wiped everything down with acetone, then applied the structural putty with a wooden tongue depressor. The best way I found to get a smooth finish was by bending my plastic putty knife into a rounded shape and then sliding it along the material. The smoother you can make the transition, the less sanding you'll have to do later. It's been 24 hours since putting this down. Now we're gonna go ahead and sand it and get it smooth and then nice and round before we lay our glass. I sanded down the transition by hand with 20 grit sandpaper. The structural putty does have pieces of fiberglass in it, so I use my wet vac through the process to suck up any dust. Just so you can understand the concept of what we're trying to accomplish here with the fiberglass onto our hull and to our stringer, I'm gonna be cutting strips that are 4 inches and 6 inches long. I'll start with the 4-inch strips, and it'll look something like this. And then we're gonna come back with a 6-inch strip, which will overlap so we don't have a thick seam, so it overlaps there. And then we're gonna have after we do this side, we'll come back with a cap on top of the stringer, and it'll be a 4-inch strip that lines up here with this 4-inch strip right here. So that way it will actually blend that and it'll be flush. And then we'll come back at the end and we'll have another 6-inch that overlaps that. And so this is all gonna be the 1708 fiberglass, which is both woven, and on the back it's kind of a chopped strand mat, which are CSM. That being said, I got busy cutting out my 3 pieces of 4-inch cloth and 3 pieces of 6-inch cloth that were all 12 feet long for my stringer. We're gonna go ahead and start with the 4-inch piece first. I'm gonna come back with the 6-inch piece on this side. Then, if we have enough daylight, we'll do the other side, 4-inch, 6-inch, and then we'll do the top. Having them in rolls made it extremely easy to work with as I glass them to the stringer. Up until this point, I had only used a brush to apply the resin, but when you're working with this amount of material, time is not on your side. So I used a 3/8-inch nap roller to quickly saturate the cloth, and then came back with my fin roller to work out any bubbles before each additional layer. My camera died before the final 6-inch cap, but I was able to get all of this installed in one session. Also, by using a roller and putting the material out in a pan, it helps it not to cure as quickly because it's spread out over a larger surface area. All right, you can see we have the center stringer in. It's looking pretty good. We got it all the way to the back. Now I did try and do that last layup really quick with the 6-inch layer or width of fiberglass on top of it, and when I did, I tried to run the whole length of the stringer at one time just to speed up the process, and there's an air bubble right here. You can see it. What I'll probably do, if I don't just leave it, is put a little hole there and inject it with a syringe with some resin, and then put a piece of cloth over the top of the hole. At the back of the stringer, I glassed over the hole that allows water to get from one side of the stringer to the drain side. So I borrowed a hole saw from a friend and used my Dremel to open that back up. All right, so you can see we had our hole cut through to the other side. What I'm gonna do is take that 5200 adhesive and then just coat the inside of this entire hole. And I'm also gonna put some on these two holes where I'm gonna be mounting my bilge pump. Now that I have my stringer installed, I can finish the remaining cuts on my cross braces. I needed to cut a slot for my center stringer with a little extra space on either side to allow water to flow freely from the front to the back of the boat. Once I made the cuts, I gave it a test fit and discovered that after doing the glass work for my stringer, the cross brace no longer was level at the top where the floor would be sitting. So I had to make a couple of alterations to the bottom. And one way to do it, you can shine a light through on one side and you can see where the light's coming through and where it's not. And so what I've done is I've marked where the light's not coming through, and that's where I'm gonna remove some material, which is about right here. So I'm gonna remove this and we'll see if it sits flush. After altering the front brace, I cut the brace out for the back of the boat and made sure it was level as well. So we got our rear support finally trimmed out to where it fits the contour of the bottom of the boat. It's level here and over here. And now what we'll do is we're gonna have to cut out an additional slot here and up in this front support to extend all the way up to the front of the boat up there. I laid my center support for the floor across my braces, marked where they would intersect, and then cut a slot so that it could recess down into the cross brace. Now that I had all the structure complete and level, I could prep everything to be fiberglassed. I sanded every board with a 20 grit sandpaper and then started the process of coating everything with my ISO tooling polyester resin. After everything had been coated with resin, I used Marine 5200 to adhere the front cross brace to the hull of the boat, but I decided to put one layer of fiberglass on the back portion of the rear cross brace because I knew it would be hard to get to it once it's installed. After I glassed the backside, I was able to install it to the hull with Marine 5200 just like I did the front cross brace. Next, I sanded down the cross braces where I would be creating a smooth transition with the polyester structural putty for my fiberglass cloth. After everything was sanded, I mixed up my putty. When mixing resin, I only mix for 1 minute unless it's a larger batch of 650 milliliters or more. However, when I mix putty, I always set my timer for 2 minutes of mixing before I start applying it to my material.
Then I'm gonna apply it with just a tongue depressor, and then I'm going to bend this blade and I'm gonna smooth it out along the edges, just so it's a nice round edge.
Again, the smoother you can make the transition when you put down the putty, the less sanding you'll need to do before fiberglassing. After everything was dry, I sanded down the putty with 20 grit sandpaper to prep it for fiberglass. All right, so we got our cross supports in. I just set this in here. I'm gonna take it out even though I'm really excited because it looks awesome. But I'm gonna put fiberglass on either side of this one, and I already have it on the back. I'm gonna tab in on the back side of that. I'll do fiberglass on here. When applying the fiberglass cloth to the cross braces, I used a brush to wet down the surface with resin, laid down my cloth, and then saturated the top until all my cloth was transparent with no bubbles. All right, it's another day, and we got these fixed to the boat. So both of the cross supports are in, and today we're gonna be putting in the top piece for that 2x4 that is right here.
All right, so I cut all of the fiberglass off of here and sanded the top down, sanded this down. I did the lap joint. You can see I sanded all this, I cut this out to get ready for my support. And then up here, I sanded and prepped all this place just to receive the front end of this piece of wood. what I'm going to do is take the structural putty and I'm going to fill all this void and round it out. That way it's nice and easy to fiberglass over it whenever I'm done.
After doing the front of the top support, I made the transitions for where it meets up with the cross braces.
Alright, you can see here's the grooves we made from up top. You can see it's just curved, and so that'll allow that fiberglass cloth just to roll right over. So I'm going to lightly sand this, each one of these. I'm going to have, if you're going to sand this, and then at the back, or the front, we have this. I'm going to sand all that smooth, and then we'll have some fiberglass over that.
Once everything was sanded and wiped down with the acetone, I was ready to join the top support to my cross braces with fiberglass.
So the original top support had this 1x along the side where the two pieces of plywood join up. And so I cut some 1x's. These are treated lumber, sanded them down with 80 grit sandpaper, and then I coated them with my laminating resin. So now what we're gonna do is I'm going to coat the entire bottom of this and all of the pieces of wood that I've used the laminating resin on with the surface seal, which will be a hard, tack-free surface. So we'll get started with that right now.
Surface Seal is a wax additive from Fiberglass Warehouse that you add to the laminating resin when applying your final coat. Resins with wax create a tack-free surface and must be sanded in the event you decide to do more layers. Here I have the two 1x's on either side of the center support, and I will be clamping them together to hold them in place while I pre-drill the location for my screws. The screws I'll be using are 305 grade stainless steel, and I would have preferred 2 1/4 in length, but the shorter screws were considered trim screws, which had smaller heads, which I didn't like. I was discouraged from getting a higher grade stainless steel such as 316 grade because the metal would have been much softer, not allowing you to back the screw out and or reuse it, which I found even happened to some of the 305 grade screws, so I'm glad I didn't get the higher grade stainless steel. Once the screws are installed, I'm going to coat the heads with Marine 5200. I also used a metal yardstick to ensure all my flooring was level as I screwed in the 1x's. Before screwing the 1x's into the center support, I coated the backs with Marine 5200 adhesive. I also used staples to alternate the pattern of my screws. They were 18 gauge 1.5 inch stainless steel narrow crown staples that were 316 grade from a company called Grip Right.
All right guys, we have the structure complete. After this step, we'll be installing the flooring.
Pro tips: if you're taking on a project like this, you can start with cardboard templates, but know it's not going to be perfect. I transferred my cardboard templates to pieces of scrap wood, which gave me the best indication of what shape or contour my material needed to be, and then cut out my actual material based on the scrap wood. Also, throughout this process, your hands are going to inevitably get sticky when working with resin, but there are times when you need clean hands. Put 2 or 3 pairs of gloves on before you start working with resin, so if you need resin-free gloves, you can easily pull off the top layer. Lastly, wear a watch with a timer. Every time I start a new batch of resin or putty, I use my watch timer to keep track of both mix times and how long I had been working with the material before it cured. I had about 20 minutes per batch of resin and 30 minutes per batch of putty before it became too difficult to work with.
All right guys, I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below. If you like this video, like it. If you're watching on Medium, you can subscribe. Feel free to subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Peace and God bless.